"Have you two set a date yet?" Her father asked it so casually I nearly dropped my glass right there at the table. My name is Owen Bennett, I'm 31, and 3 hours before that question I had never once spoken to the woman whose wedding plans I was apparently now discussing. I'd moved into a modest house on a tree-lined street in Cincinnati, Ohio about 4 months earlier, taking a job as a project estimator for a construction firm after a long stretch of bouncing between contract work in Kentucky. I didn't know many people yet, mostly nodding at neighbors from my driveway until a Saturday afternoon when a woman named Claire Whitfield knocked on my door, looking apologetic, and asked if I could help carry a broken dresser and a few boxes out of her garage before her parents arrived that evening. I agreed, mostly because my own Saturday plans consisted of nothing more than laundry, and we spent the next hour hauling furniture, laughing about how neither of us had actually unpacked fully since moving in, comparing notes on the neighborhood's aggressive homeowners association. When we finished, dusty and slightly out of breath, she thanked me and, somewhat hesitantly, invited me to stay for dinner since she'd already made enough food for 4 people. I said yes, expecting a quiet, polite meal before heading home. What I didn't know, and wouldn't learn until much later, was that Claire's mother had been increasingly vocal about wanting grandchildren, so vocal that during a phone call weeks earlier, Claire had impulsively claimed she was engaged just to buy herself a few months of peace before the truth inevitably came out. Claire told me the full story later, though it's worth understanding how it actually unfolded, because she said afterward she'd replayed that phone call more times than she could count, trying to pinpoint the exact moment it spun out of control. Her mother had called on a Sunday evening, the third time that month, bringing up how Claire's younger cousin had just announced a pregnancy, and wouldn't it be wonderful if Claire settled down too? And Claire, exhausted from a long week and tired of hearing the same gentle pressure disguised as concern, blurted out that she was actually engaged, purely to end the conversation before it went any further. Her mother's reaction was so immediate and overwhelming, an audible scream of joy, immediate demands for details, that Claire found herself unable to walk it back without seeming like she'd cruelly gotten her mother's hopes up for nothing, so she kept inventing. A proposal at a lake house, a ring currently being sized, a wedding sometime in the next year or two. She assumed the story would quietly fade the way most exaggerated phone calls eventually did. Instead, her parents announced 2 weeks later that they were driving down specifically to finally meet her fiancé in person, and Claire spent the following days in a slow-building panic that culminated in her knocking on my door, asking for help with a broken dresser. Less out of urgent need, and more because she was quietly hoping, against all logic, that some kind of solution might present itself before dinner started. Her parents, Diane and Harold, arrived precisely on time, and dinner started pleasantly. Easy conversation about my job, the neighborhood, how long I'd lived there. Then, without any warning at all, Harold set down his fork, looked directly at me, and asked, "Have you two set a date yet?" I stared at him, certain I'd misheard, then looked at Claire, whose face had gone pale in a way that told me this was not, in fact, a misunderstanding on my part. "A date for what?" I asked carefully, and the silence that followed felt like it lasted an entire minute rather than the 2 or 3 seconds it probably actually was. Claire finally spoke, her voice slightly too high, explaining to her parents that we hadn't quite settled on anything yet. We wanted to enjoy being engaged a little longer before rushing into planning. Diane's hands flew to her mouth, tears immediately welling up, while Harold reached across the table to shake my hand with the enthusiasm of a man who'd apparently been waiting years for this exact moment. Before I could process what had just happened, the questions started. When did I propose? Where was the ring? Had we picked a venue yet? And Claire fielded most of it herself, inventing details with a speed that told me this cover story, whatever it was, had clearly not been planned in advance, which somehow made it more alarming rather than less. Under the table, her foot pressed against mine urgently, and the second her parents got distracted arguing about whether Harold's cousin should be invited to a wedding that did not exist, she leaned toward me and whispered 4 words that would define my entire evening. "Please, just go with it." I sat there weighing my options in real time. I could stand up immediately and explain that I was, in fact, a neighbor who had been carrying a dresser 2 hours earlier and had no ring, no proposal, and no idea what venue anyone was referring to, and watch Claire's humiliation unfold in front of the 2 people she most wanted to make proud. Or I could play along for one dinner and sort out the details once her parents were gone. Looking at the quiet desperation behind her eyes, the decision made itself. I smiled, picked up my fork, and said we were thinking sometime next fall, though nothing was official yet, vague enough that Claire could build on it however she needed. For the rest of the meal, I became, against every reasonable instinct, Claire's fiancé, a role considerably larger than the one I'd expected when I agreed to help move a dresser. I complimented Diane's cooking, listened to Harold describe his own wedding 4 decades earlier in exhaustive detail, and even laughed convincingly at a story about how nervous I'd apparently been proposing, an event that, as far as I knew, had never taken place. Just when I thought the worst of it was over, Diane pulled out her phone and asked if she could see pictures of the ring, since apparently Claire had been suspiciously vague about the details on their last phone call. Claire's hand found mine under the table, gripping hard enough to bruise, and I answered as smoothly as I could manage, saying the ring was actually being resized at the moment, which was the only excuse either of us could think of on the spot to explain its convenient absence. Diane accepted this without much suspicion, already scrolling through wedding venues on her phone and asking whether we'd considered the botanical garden downtown, the one her own sister had used for her wedding 15 years earlier. Just as I thought the questioning had settled down, Claire's younger sister Megan, who'd apparently been listening from the kitchen doorway the entire time, wandered in and sat down across from me with the deliberate posture of someone who didn't quite believe the story. She asked, arms crossed, where exactly I'd proposed, since Claire had told their mother it happened at a lake house, but told her, weeks earlier, that it happened at a restaurant downtown. My stomach dropped. Claire jumped in before I could answer, laughing it off, claiming the proposal itself had happened at the restaurant, but I'd surprised her again with a second, more private moment at the lake house the following weekend, essentially 2 proposals for the price of one, which was ridiculous enough that Megan almost smiled despite herself. She wasn't fully convinced, I could tell, studying me for a long moment before shrugging and grabbing a piece of bread, apparently deciding the mystery wasn't worth ruining her mother's good evening over. When the pound cake came out, Diane fussing over whether it needed more berries on top, Harold reached over and clapped me firmly on the shoulder, telling me how relieved he was that Claire had finally found someone steady after her last relationship had fallen apart so publicly 2 years earlier. A story I was hearing about for the first time in my life while pretending it was old, familiar information. When her parents finally said their goodbyes near the door, hugging me like I'd already been part of the family for a decade, I stood there feeling both relieved and utterly exhausted. The moment the car pulled out of the driveway, Claire shut the door, pressed her back against it, and slid slowly to the floor, laughing and groaning at the same time. Okay, that got wildly out of hand, she said, dragging both hands down her face. I told my mom I was engaged months ago, just to get her to stop asking about grandchildren, and I never thought she'd actually plan a visit expecting to meet my fiancé and discuss venues. I asked why she hadn't corrected it the moment her mother mentioned visiting, and Claire admitted quietly that some part of her had wanted, just for one evening, to feel like the version of her life her parents had been hoping for. We sat on her kitchen floor for the next 2 hours, dissecting the entire dinner, laughing about the ring excuse, comparing notes on which details had nearly given us away, until it stopped feeling like damage control and started feeling like the easiest conversation I'd had with anyone in months. Before I left, I told her, half joking, that pretending to be engaged after one dinner had officially ruined me for normal small talk with strangers. She laughed and admitted she hoped this wouldn't be the last time she saw me, fake fiancé or not. 2 weeks later, disaster struck in the form of a phone call. Diane had booked a walkthrough at the Botanical Garden for the following month, assuming we'd want to see the venue in person, and had already told Harold's entire side of the family the wedding would likely happen next fall. Claire showed up at my door holding her phone like it might explode, asking if this was the point where I finally ran. I told her I'd already survived one dinner as her fiancé. I could probably survive a venue walkthrough, though some part of me suspected I was underestimating the situation considerably. We spent that evening mapping out a longer, more sustainable story, deciding together that the most honest path forward was slowing things down publicly, telling her parents we wanted a longer engagement before locking in any plans, buying ourselves time without technically unraveling the lie all at once. The Botanical Garden walkthrough, when it finally happened a month later, turned out to be less of a disaster than either of us feared, mostly because Diane did all the talking while Claire and I trailed behind, exchanging looks every time the coordinator asked a question neither of us could honestly answer, like our preferred flower arrangements or whether we wanted a spring or fall ceremony. Somewhere between the rose garden and the fountain, Claire grabbed my hand, not for show this time, just because, and admitted quietly that walking through a wedding venue with me didn't feel nearly as absurd as it should have. Over the following months, what began as a single dinner spiraled into something neither of us expected. Long phone calls that had nothing to do with wedding logistics, real dates that slowly replaced the fictional ones, until the boundary between the fiancé I was pretending to be and the person I actually wanted to become for her stopped being a boundary at all. Almost 2 years later, on a quiet evening at that same botanical garden, no longer pretending anything for anyone, I got down on one knee for real. And when Claire said yes through tears that had nothing to do with panic this time, I couldn't help thinking that Harold's oddly timed question at that first dinner had somehow, against all odds, turned out to be less of a mistake and more of a prediction. When Diane and Harold visited again the following spring, Claire didn't need to whisper instructions under the table or invent details on the spot. I was simply there, already known, already woven into her life in ways that had nothing to do with a panicked dinner months earlier. The guy who'd once carried a broken dresser out of her garage and somehow ended up staying for a lot longer than either of us had planned.